A casual shopper in London browses a luxury watch website just once, and for the next 3 weeks, that exact watch follows them across every news site, social media platform, and weather app they visit. That isn't just advertising, that is systematic tracking. Under the GDPR, specifically Recital 24, we focus on the monitoring of data subject behavior within the European Union. In simple terms, this means if an organization is watching what you do, where you go, and what you click on to predict your preferences, they are officially in the monitoring business. It doesn't matter if they are based in Mumbai or Berlin. If they are tracking people located in the EU, the GDPR applies to them. We are talking about the difference between a store clerk remembering your face and a digital system mapping your entire personality. So now that we have mastered the core concept of what constitutes systematic monitoring in the eyes of the law, you might be wondering how we distinguish between simple analytics and invasive tracking. Well, that brings us right into our next step, which is behavioral profiling. Imagine a fitness app that tracks more than just your steps. It logs your heart rate, your sleep patterns, your location during your morning run, and even the times you usually feel stressed. It then uses that data to suggest health insurance packages or high-priced diet plans. That is behavioral profiling, the automated processing of personal data to analyze or predict aspects like personal preferences, health, or location. The definition essentially says that if you are using data to build a quote predictive model of a person, you are performing a regulated activity. You have probably seen this at the office, where marketing teams want to quote segment users to death. We have to be careful because when you turn a human being into a data-driven prediction, the GDPR treats that as a high-stakes activity. It is not just about identifying them. It is about guessing what they will do next. So now that we've mastered the art of behavioral profiling and why it triggers such strict oversight, you might be wondering how we determine if our tracking actually falls under the GDPR's long reach. Well, that brings us right into our next step, which is the territorial scope of tracking. Think of a small travel agency in Tokyo that has no offices, no employees, and no presence in Europe. However, they run a massive multi-language ad campaign specifically targeting tourists in Paris and Rome, offering them custom-tailored trip itineraries based on their past browsing history. Even though they never set foot in Europe, they are monitoring people in the EU. Article 3 of the GDPR is very clear. The law applies to organizations outside the EU if they offer goods or services to people in the EU or monitor their behavior there. It is like an invisible fence that follows the data subject, not the company. You have probably seen projects at the office where someone says, "Oh, we aren't in Europe, so we don't have to worry about GDPR." But they are tracking user behavior on their European-facing app. That is a dangerous mistake. The targeting of behavior is the trigger, regardless of where your servers are located. So, now that we've mastered the rules regarding who gets caught by the GDPR's global net, you might be wondering how we distinguish between harmless website maintenance and actual monitoring. Well, that brings us right into our next step, which is analytics versus monitoring. A local bakery website in Delhi uses a basic hit counter to see how many people visited their page on a Sunday. That is a simple anonymous traffic measurement. Now compare that to a global fashion retailer that places a pixel on every visitor's browser to track their scroll depth, the duration of their visit, and whether they abandoned their cart. That is invasive monitoring. The GDPR doesn't want to stop you from knowing how many people click your link. It wants to stop you from following people across the web to build a profile without their consent. The distinction lies in intent and persistence. If you are just counting heads, you are safe. If you are tracking the individual's journey across the web, you are monitoring behavior. Stay with me here. If you can't tell who the person is or where they came from, you generally aren't monitoring behavior in the way the law fears. But if you have a persistent identifier that ties one session to another, you have stepped into the regulatory spotlight. So, now that we've mastered how to draw the line between simple traffic stats and actual behavior monitoring, you might be wondering how to handle the inevitable conflicts between marketing and privacy. Well, that brings us right into our next step, which is managing stakeholder conflict. You are running an e-commerce platform in Mumbai, and your marketing head wants to implement a heat map tool that records exactly where users click, how their mouse moves, and what they hover over. Your privacy team, meanwhile, points out that this technically records the user's behavior. This is a classic everyday corporate conflict. The GDPR doesn't tell you to stop marketing. It tells you to build a system that respects the user's rights through transparency and consent. You have to decide which tracking is truly essential and which is just nice to have. If you try to track every mouse movement just because you can, your project becomes a compliance liability. The key is to manage these relationships and document your choices. You are the bridge between the technical team that wants all the data and the privacy office that wants to mitigate risk. You have to ensure that every tracking pixel is documented and, more importantly, consented to. So now that we've mastered how to balance the hunger for data with the requirements of privacy law, you might be wondering how this process stays compliant as new technologies pop up. Well, that brings us right into our next step, which is monitoring for the long haul. A major financial institution in Kolkata built an AI-driven behavior monitoring system 5 years ago. Back then, cookie banners were simple pop-ups that people clicked without thinking. Today, the laws are much stricter, and the government expects that institution to treat every tracking event as a deliberate decision. This is why monitoring for behavior isn't a one-time setup. It is a living cycle of audits and reviews. The law requires that you constantly check your tracking methods to see if they still align with privacy standards. A company that sets up tracking once and forgets about it is like a ship captain who stops looking at the radar in the middle of a storm. You need to keep your finger on the pulse of your data flows. If you haven't reviewed your tracking pixels or behavioral algorithms in the last 6 months, you are likely already out of sync with current requirements. Let's make sure your systems don't become outdated and dangerous. Keep your audit trail fresh and your tracking transparent. You have now moved from the theory of behavior monitoring to the practical daily task of proving you have everything under control. You have the map, the definitions, and the strategy. You are ready to handle the complex world of EU data protection.